Hello, welcome to Chateau de Tiregand. We're here in the Dordogne, a few kilometers from Bergerac. We're in an area called Pêchardmont, so we make quite a lot of wine. We're a few kilometers from Montbazillac in a very wine-growing area. And Chateau de Tiregand overlooks the Dordogne Valley, which continues on to Bergerac. The chateau dates back to the 18th century and was extensively rebuilt in the 19th century. It was bought by the Lapanus family in the early 19th century in 1826, who have always lived here and then passed through marriage to the Boutré family and then to the Saint-Exupéry family. So it's a family that has left its mark on this house, having stayed here for almost 200 years. I just took over this chateau a little over a month ago to open it to the public for the first time in its history. I invite you to follow me and discover some of the rooms in the chateau and on the estate. Let's go inside the porch. One of Tiregand's characteristics is that it was built by an architect called Louis Garros, who did a lot of work in the Bordeaux and Biterrois regions and who was inspired by English neo-Gothic. We find elements of architecture that are more likely to be found in England. The dome, for example, is quite astonishing and immediately impresses visitors when they arrive at the chateau. We're here in the stairwell, which was built in the mid-19th century in a pavilion that brings together the part that was built in the 19th century and the 18th century part, which was there just before. There's this system of large enfilade salons with the dining room, the small music room, and then a tangle of small rooms, all served by a large service corridor that we'll see next. We'll now move on to the 18th century section, the oldest part of the chateau, with the largest rooms, which were really dedicated to entertaining. This is the Grand Salon, the largest room in the chateau. At the time, there was a 19th century ceiling that had been broken by termites, and just below it, they found the beautiful 18th century French ceiling. We're in the process of finding solutions to reupholster the upper part and hide the bad condition of the exposed walls so as to create a large room with high ceilings. Here, you can see the difference between the French ceiling, which was just above, and the 19th century ceiling, which is right here. There's a plaster ceiling on lath. The idea is to leave the ceiling visible because the 18th century ceiling is truly magnificent, and to find a solution for covering the walls. That's why we're re-roofing, to really have that continuity all the way up to the ceiling. We arrive in the Napoleon III style dining room, which is quite dark. We find the characteristics of this period again with the fashion for black furniture. There are red tones, garlands of flowers, and quite beautiful paint decorations above the woodwork on the doors. In those days, there must have been a beautiful earthenware stove, as was common in 19th century dining rooms. Now, Athena sits enthroned, goddess of wisdom, watching over us as we dine, with certain portraits. Here, it's a portrait of Athanas de Lapanus, a member of the family who was the owner's brother-in-law at the time. After that, there are other paintings, but they're not related to the family, they're more decorative. Let's continue the enfilade and move on to the small music room. It's worth noting that the owners in the 19th century were great enthusiasts of music and art in general, and this is very much reflected in the house. They were great music lovers. They had a collection of old 19th century music scores. All the great composers can be found here. It's going to be Beethoven, it's going to be Massenet. A lot of composers who were very well known at the time and still are today. The idea is to bring back a little of the spirit that the former owners had around music, and of that very characteristic period too. There are many things to say about this room. Here we can really see the former owner's desire to have a chateau with a real connection to art in general. We find these fake playbooks with the T of Tiregand and the Count's crown, which is numbered. There are 25 of them and they are quite exceptional. Inside there are hundreds of plays. Here we have already passed through the largest rooms of the castle, the 18th century pavilion, then the succession of dining rooms and salons. After that, we move on to the smaller, more intimate rooms. The principle is still the same, a small fireplace, a small secretary. There's a delightful little library that must be 19th century, but they've kept the 18th century spirit, redoing the moldings in that style and painting in 18th century grey. We'll move upstairs via the small staircase in the middle, which bisects the facade. This brings us to the large corridor on the upper floor of the chateau's main facade. It communicates with 6 bedrooms, which are the 6 most beautiful rooms in the chateau. It's important to remember that the chateau was created in the 19th century to receive people, as can be seen in the reception rooms of the 18th century pavilion. Afterwards, all these people had to be accommodated. There were almost 45 rooms in the chateau, including servants' quarters. It really was a big house for entertaining. We're currently redoing several rooms that will be used during the tour. What's so unique about Tiregand is that it's a tangle of periods, particularly in the wallpaper. Here we're going to enter the largest room in the chateau. Hello, Pascal. Everything is going well? Pascal Collan, our upholsterer, who has been with us for a very long time, is reupholstering this room. There was a wallpaper that was quite pretty, but it was a bit bland. The idea was really to highlight this large room, so we chose a slightly burgundy pink, which is really coming along nicely. That's it for the largest room in the chateau. Let's continue and we'll get to the stairwell floor. Before we go back downstairs, we'll move on to another section, the first floor of the 18th century pavilion. This is where the work really begins. We're in the process of bringing out all the old curtains that have been stored since the 19th century. We're trying to figure out where the curtains were placed so we can recreate the atmosphere of the house at the end of the 19th century. We're going to a part of the building that was converted into an apartment in the late 19th century and which hasn't been inhabited since the late 30s. There's a real atmosphere here. You can tell it's a bit run down. There's a lot of damage. It's this part that we'll be trying to emphasize during our visit this summer. There will be a little chambermaid here waiting for people. She will take people and lead them through these different rooms. We'll have a slightly subdued atmosphere, and with the shutters closed, a little luminous atmosphere. The idea is for them to walk into an apartment as if nothing had changed for 50 years. We had a gentleman's room next door and a lady's room there. With religious paintings, we're trying to recreate a bit of a decor with what we've already found at the chateau and what we've hunted down in a few flea markets. That's all for that part. We've now taken a tour of the castle's most important rooms, both upstairs and on the ground floor. Now we're going to move on to the outside to get a slightly nicer overall view, because there's a beautiful garden with rose bushes on the facades. We'll find out right away. There are 3 adjoining terraces. There's the oldest terrace from the 18th century with the pavilion we saw earlier, which had its counterpart at the time and was destroyed during the Revolution. And here we have the second main terrace of the chateau, with this facade, with all these rose bushes hanging on the wall, which gives a very romantic and pleasant feel to the house. I'm a bit ashamed because the garden isn't maintained, because I got a bit ahead of myself, and since I took over the chateau a little less than a month ago, I've had to buy back all the equipment needed for maintenance. So that takes a bit of time, and I've also only got 2 months to open the chateau to the public. So it's quite a challenge. So I'm showing you a garden that hasn't been tended at all, but will be this summer, and it's going to be very tidy. Then we'll move on to the last terrace, which is more practical, more domestic, the vegetable garden terrace, with a beautiful 18th century orangery and a workshop from beginning of the 20th century. In the vegetable garden, with its tall grasses, we'll be making hay in June. And if you have a good eye, you'll see a delightful 18th century belvedere, also known as a bandstand. And here we have a typical 18th century belvedere with faces on each frame, overlooking the Dordogne valley, with a beautiful chateau, Chateau de Pile, also owned by the same family at the time. And the orangery, which was also converted into a chapel in the 19th century in the last section. The rest of the building was preserved as a practical part of the orangery. So we find the characteristics of an orangery, with these large French windows that open up, very bright. There are a few wires hanging from the ceiling. So for a long time, we wondered what they were for, since in an orangery it was generally rare to find this kind of thing. The reason is that in those days, the owners simply dried tobacco for their own personal consumption. And so here we come to a workshop which is quite exceptional. Because it's completely in its original state, with a magnificent patina. And then with all these machines, there's the little forge, a beautiful workbench, all these machines running on a belt system. So it's quite extraordinary to see all this going on, even though it's over 100 years old. It's always nice to see these machines in operation again. And now we're going to move on to a small courtyard, which is just as delightful, with rose bushes on the walls. This courtyard was called the ostrich courtyard, because at the time, in the 19th century, it was fashionable to have ostrich feathers in castle interiors. So I may be talking nonsense, but that's what I've been told. And this courtyard was dedicated to 2 or 3 ostriches, which, according to the former owners, must have been here, and were therefore used to have these feathers in the interiors. So it's quite atypical. You can also see the water cistern, also built in the 19th century, which is fed by a borehole drilled at the same time, and which draws on the water table 326 meters away in the chateau's inner courtyard, which we'll see next. And so here we are, entering the chateau's inner courtyard, the main courtyard, with 3 magnificent plane trees, and a courtyard that is divided into 2 parts. One that is called Maison de Maître, which we visited earlier, and the communal part with the stables, the carriage house, the garage, the tack room, and the woodshed, and the servants' quarters just above. I'm going to show you part of it. It's a bit of a work in progress, being used as a workshop for the moment. We've rediscovered the soul of the stables as they once were. Unfortunately, it was removed because at one time the stables were no longer as useful as they once were. And so in the long term, the aim is to rehabilitate them. Here there were 4 stalls and a box on each side, so it was a nice stable. And there are still the old horse plates, Emir, Mandarin, Bonhomme, which give it a certain atmosphere. We didn't have time to do all the rooms, as it would have taken several hours. But I hope you've had a good look at the house. So now we're going to leave via the porch and return to the castle entrance. We've come full circle with a nice little tour of the chateau on the ground floor, upstairs and outside. Thanks for following me. There's still a lot of work to be done on the chateau. The aim is to open it for the season on July 1st. So I hope I'll be able to meet you there with great pleasure to discover a rather innovative tour system. The aim is to immerse people in the 19th century, which is very much present here, and to take them on a journey back in time 150 years ago.